Great. So this is a tale with a twist, is my assignment, and it comes from the Grimm's fairy tales, and it's called The Shoemaker and the Elves. A shoemaker, by no fault of her own, had become so poor that all she had left was leather to make one last pair of shoes. So one night, she sits down at her work table and cuts out the pattern for one last pair of shoes. She sets it on her work table and then goes to sleep. And the next morning, she wakes up and goes back to her work table to get to work, and finds before her 2 pairs of shoes already made. Astounded, she picks the shoes up and looking upon them closely realizes that there is not one bad stitch, as if they were made for a masterpiece. And so, that very same day, a young person comes into the shop and buys the shoes, and he is so pleased with him that he offers more money than is customary. And with this money, the shoemaker has enough to make 2 more pairs of shoes. And so she buys more leather. She cuts out the pattern for 2 more pairs of shoes and places it on her work table, and then goes back to sleep. And the next morning she wakes up and she returns to her workbench to find that, again, 2 pairs of shoes are already made. And just as quickly they sell again. And with the money from those 2 pairs of shoes, the shoemaker has enough to make 4 more pairs of shoes. And so she takes her fabric and she cuts out the pattern for the shoes, places it on her workbench, and goes to bed for the evening. And again, she wakes up in the morning, ready to set to work, and at her workbench, the shoes are already made. And so this continues constantly, that every night when she cuts out the pattern, the next morning the shoes are already made. And soon enough, the shoemaker becomes a wealthy woman. And one night she says to her wife, "We should stay awake and hide in the corner of the room and see who these helping hands are coming from." And the wife agrees, and so that night they hide in the corner of the room, and just at midnight, a little elf comes and sits at the workbench, ready to set to work on the pair of shoes. And before him, they start to stitch and sew and hammer so skillfully with their tiny little fingers until the shoes are all made and they stand upon the table in delight and then run out the door. And the shoemaker and her wife are watching, completely astonished. And the next morning, the shoemaker's wife says,
"These elves have made us rich. We must show them how grateful we are. They run around with clothes so drab. We should make them new clothes. I'll stitch them socks, and you make them shoes."
And the shoemaker agrees, and so they set to work to make some beautiful presents for the elf that has helped them become rich. And so after a few days of hard work, they excitedly place the new clothes on the workbench instead of shoes. And again, they hide in the corner of the room and wait to see what will happen. And at midnight, the elf returns, ready to set to work. And as they approach the workbench, they realize that there are no shoes to be cut, but a beautiful dress. At first, they're astounded, and then they show intense delight. And they dress themselves in the beautiful clothing and begin to sing and dance.
La 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 la. Oh, I'm so pretty. Oh, it's so pretty. Lovely clothes.
And skipping and dancing about the room, jumping over benches and chairs until finally they run out the door. And from that moment on, The elf never is to be seen again, but the shoemaker and her wife live happily, and all of their undertakings prosper.
Wonderful, wonderful.
That's great.
Good job.
Good job, Sarah. Good job, Josie and Caitlin.